Hello and welcome to a new season and a new episode of the Land Party Lawyers podcast. To our regular listeners, welcome back. And to our new ones, on this podcast, we tackle issues at the intersection of video games, law, and business. My name is Steve, and for this episode, I'm joined by my friend and a former host of this podcast, Nick Brown. Nick, as you know, is no longer a colleague of mine at the firm, but we're still very much connected, and he is going to be, as we kind of restart up Land Party Lawyers this season, a regular contributor to the podcast. And so we're kind of shaking up.
Despite my best efforts, I can't shake Steve. I can't quit you, and I'm no longer a host, but I'm excited to stay involved as a contributor. And so I'm looking forward to being part of it going forward.
And we're looking forward, and we're looking forward to that too. We're actually going to shake up the podcast a little bit. We're going to drill down more on the legal issues and keep it informative, engaging. And again, at its heart, we always wanted this to be educational. We'll still have interviews, and you can also be on the lookout for new voices as well. Other contributors and colleagues will join me on the podcast to host other episodes. So what hasn't changed, however...
just when that happens, listeners, grade them on a curve. They may not be as experienced, so, you got to give them the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, sure. But what hasn't changed is that nothing we say is legal advice, especially stuff coming out of Nick's mouth. If anything, just kind of accept the opposite is true. Without further ado, on this episode, we're going to be explaining the legal framework for esports gambling. And so, Nick, I'm going to start off by asking you a question. And this is really, depending on how you answer it, this could be a short podcast. But is it legal to gamble on esports?
That's an excellent question and timely. Generally, the answer is no. It is not legal to gamble on esports. And to understand why, we're going to have to talk about gambling generally. But as you'll see, there are some enormous exceptions to that rule, some that are big enough to drive a truck through. But you have to be careful about when and where and how you do it. So just basically gambling, what is it? As what are we talking about today and what are we not talking about? Gambling is viewed differently, state to state, country to country, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but basically, there's three common elements that you'll find. One is consideration. It's the thing that you risk, the thing that you pay. Chance is the second one, which is some element of luck or randomization as opposed to skill. And then third is the prize, the winning. It's something of value that you can get back, whether it's your investment, whether it's more, whether it's something else. Those are kind of the three pieces that generally make up the puzzle of an act of gambling.
And it's important to highlight what gambling is not, right? Just as you said, what gambling is not. Sweepstakes or prize-less or without a prize, chance-based games or skill-based games. Those are all contests or activities that are generally lawful, but many of those regulated in other ways. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. Our focus is going to be zeroed in on gambling, that activity in and of itself. So if at some point...
Put away your sweepstakes
exactly.
application.
Don't come at me with this is a skill-based game, because we're not talking about those. We're talking about
because we don't play skill-based games.
Yeah, well, exactly. You're all chance. A lot of Hearthstone going on these days, as usual.
Right.
Other key important thing to keep in mind for gambling is that gambling activities occur in kind of two different places at once. It definitely occurs where the bettor resides, and also where the better service is offered, the bettor, OR. Okay, so in that vein, taking bets from people in the U.S., even though you operate in a foreign country, will still subject you to U.S. laws, pretty much. So that's just something else to keep in mind.
It's a both situation, not an either or.
Right. So, Nick, why don't you give us a little brief history lesson on gambling regulation in the U.S.?
Sure. Just from a 30,000 foot view, all the way back in 1961, there was only one state that allowed legal and regulated gambling. As you might imagine, that was Nevada. where Las Vegas is. There were no state lotteries or tribal casinos
Yet.
yet. Right? They were all just waiting. But then in 1978, the state of New Jersey allowed gambling as a method to help revitalize the famous Atlantic City area.
Bring it back to the Boardwalk Empire days.
Yeah, exactly. Great show. And then based on the success of that, in the 1980s, we began to see Indian casinos popping up all over the place. And of course, fast forward to today, pretty much every state allows some form of gambling. But it's the exceptions that are allowed. It's generally a prohibition, but then followed by a series of exceptions. And in that regard, the federal government, it created a set of laws that allow it to prosecute illegal gambling activities. And when you think federal, a lot of times you think across state lines. So that's, for example, the Wire Act outlaws using wire communications to engage in illegal gambling across state lines as a general matter.
So because of that whole framework, you kind of have three different entities that are regulating gambling. You have states, Indian law, and then you have the federal government. So it's a really complicated morass, really. But let's get into sports. So Nick, why don't you tell us about the brief history of gambling on sports?
Sure. So that was gambling generally. Sports specifically, in 1992, Congress passed the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, which is abbreviated PAPSA.
PAPSA. It's fun to say.
Yeah, I feel like they could have come up with some better acronyms, but nonetheless, what that did is it basically prohibited sports wagering. But then recently, in 2018, a couple of years ago, the United States Supreme Court overturned PAPSA in a case called Murphy on the basis that PAPSA had infringed on the individual states' legislative processes. It said that the states should be allowed to handle those things themselves.
So bringing us up to speed, since that case and through the end of 2020, there were about 14 states to allow online sports wagering, with another 6 or so that are closely examining the issue. And others are probably moving in that direction as well. So you have New Jersey, which was
I'm sure they're all pretty consistent with one another, right, Steve?
Oh, you would think. But no, they're all over the place when it comes to the types of regulatory schemes that they're considering. So you have some states that allow in-person betting, prohibiting online betting, right? So you have to go to the casino in order to bet.
Got to show up in person.
Right. And then others are the exact opposite, where it's only online betting with in-person betting
show
prohibited.
Up in person.
Right. Do not come to the door. And then there are others that allow both. So that's why they're all over the map. Excuse the pun.
So to speak.
Right. So what you're left with is it's really hard to have a nationwide or a multi-state organization when these schemes are incompatible with one another. And that's why the legal compliance in this area is the opposite of, it's far from simple. It's pretty complicated.
So if you had an operation in multiple states, you may have to have them run just fundamentally differently because they cannot be compliant with both states' law at the same time.
Right. You have like a New Jersey operation, a Pennsylvania operation, Florida operation, what have you. And so then we also have gambling online, right? And that in and of itself is also regulated. Nevada was the first state to allow for it. Let's just gambling online separate and apart from sports betting.
Always leading the pack there.
Yeah, that in New Jersey in this area for sure. But through the 2001 Interactive Gaming Act, that law eventually limited to where you had to be physically located in the state in order to gamble. But that allowed for gambling online within the state. So if you were a resident and you lived in Nevada, you could gamble there.
All right, so we did gambling in general. We did gambling on sports. Mm-hmm. So now it's the big ticket item, gambling on esports. And basically, one thing to take home is that right now only a few states allow it, or at least are clear that they allow it. But even so, it's already a very significant enterprise. It's estimated to be a $1.5 billion industry with a B. And according to the analysts, it's experiencing a 30% average year-on-year revenue increase, which is enormous. But it's kind of consistent with what we've seen from the esports industry in general over the past few years.
Right. So enormous opportunity and already big dollars in this space. And so in 2017, we have Nevada that revised its wagering law to allow for wagering on quote unquote or other event. And it's that language that has allowed for gambling on esports to be permitted on a case-by-case basis.
Those 3 words are doing a lot of work there, huh?
Yeah, well, it's an
other event.
Right, so adding that language allowed for basically operators to ask whether or not these particular matches could be, whether on esports gambling would be allowed for these particular matches. And so this has actually already happened for a number of games, including League of Legends, Overwatch, CSGO, and Dota 2, which are consistently like the top 3 or 4 games that are most bet on esports.
They tend to travel together, right?
And so, there's also New Jersey. So, Nick, why don't you tell us a little about New Jersey, how they do it?
That was exactly, you read my mind, Steve. So remember we mentioned New Jersey allows sports gambling, but the law in New Jersey, bear with me here, it prohibits esports betting.
That's backwards. Okay,
by putting esports in the same category as high school sporting events, which you can't bet on in New Jersey. However,
why?
This is a whole podcast about exceptions. And so the exception to that is events that are international and where more than 50% of the players are over the age of majority, 18, then they can have esports betting on that exception to the exception. And one famous example is in November of 2019, New Jersey allowed betting on the League of Legends World Championship. It was one of the frequent flyers here.
And I asked you why that the state had done that, but now that you explained, it has to do with it. Once you explain the exception, it makes sense. We're trying to make sure that this particular event that we will otherwise allow is involving people, not minors. It involves adults over the age of 18, and if it's international,
or at least most of them.
Yeah, and then with respect to the international flair of it, I don't know if I fully understand why, other than it's just it might be better organized and have some sort of framework and structure to it, that it's not something that's fixed, which we'll get to in a second. So that's New Jersey. It's not allowed in that state unless.
You ask why internationally, it doesn't seem coincidental to me that the one that they allow was already running internationally and very lucrative. So that might be a cart in front of the horse situation, but nonetheless, that's how it works generally.
Right. So then there are a couple other states, Colorado, West Virginia for players over 18, like New Jersey. A couple other states actually just kind of touch upon the fringes of esports, but don't really address it straight on. So, for example, Maryland, they have a law that says an esport tournament organizers may offer prizes so long as the dominant element in the outcome of the match is a relative skill of the player. So it kind of goes back to that, is it skill, is it chance? And so might even not be gambling at that point. Iowa, they also have online sports betting, but the AG's office there, the Attorney General's office in that state, has said that does not include esports. Adding to the fuel to the proverbial fire that is esports a sport debate. So I'll let that one linger for a little bit. But I know that's a fun one that people like to just skip over, but it actually has some serious ramifications sometimes in the esports gambling conversations. Other states like Indiana has actually banned it. Whether they'll change their mind one day, who knows? But as states are considering gambling on sports generally, some of those states actually, whether or not esports is included, is a big question mark. Arkansas, Michigan, Rhode Island, Montana, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, to name a few. So it's a big. This is a big. It depends answer ultimately, and that's kind of what this whole episode is about. But we expect a lot of movement. That there's going to be a lot of activity over the next year as online sports betting increases. I think eventually it'll include esports as well.
Yeah, it's only a matter of time. That it's following all the other trends. It's a matter of when, not if. But the takeaway is that there's no one size fits all option. And even if you mapped out how everything worked today, it might be different tomorrow. It's almost certain to be different by the end of the year. So you got to keep your eye on the moving target.
And we're only focused on winners of the matches, right? That's not the only kind of betting. If anything, that might even
That's
not be
right.
the most popular betting that's done. There's other concepts in the marketplace to consider, such as related to gameplay, really. First one to get a kill, how long the match lasts, duration, whether or not certain point spreads are met, head-to-head, combat between two players. And also betting on skins, which is really very much gambling when you're just kind of throwing in your skins to try to get better skins. So some of that has already been actually regulated, like the skins betting, and it's been seen by our marketplace here. But a lot of this is still new. So the whole episode's about just who wins or loses, but there's other pieces to it as well to keep in mind. And that's just in the U.S.
Right. Generally, most of the betting that we're seeing is on just match winners or full tournament winners. And in that regard, the betting has to start before the match or tournament. I'm sorry, the betting must cease before the match or tournament begins. But like Steve said, there's a lot of creativity out there. And just like you see all sorts of creative betting on sports matches, whether spread or, the number of interceptions or all sorts of individual stats, I think you're going to start to see more and more of those over time as well.
Yeah. And this is where, again, this episode's about the U.S. regulations. And the U.S., by comparison, is a really restrictive place. The international scene is much more welcoming of online esports betting. In fact, the Isle of Man and Malta have approved esports betting like structures and commissions, right? One of the largest,
pretty sophisticated.
Exactly. Yeah. One of the largest esports betting companies in the world, Unicorn, is regulated by the Isle of Man, for example. So, and to operate legally, companies like that need to go abroad under those under those jurisdictions and operate in certain places that the betting is allowed. So that's kind of where we are currently. And a lot of the reason for that actually relates to match integrity, which is something we discussed earlier. So Nick, why don't you just give us a brief rundown of match integrity and why it relates to esports betting?
Yeah, sure. So, anytime people are going to be betting on the outcome of tournaments or skill-based games, then, match fixing is a big concern because you want the integrity to be there. You want your bet to mean something and you want your research and your analysis to be genuine and not just based on some backroom deal. So just like gambling regulators generally conduct thorough investigations of the gambling operations in their jurisdiction, we've seen the same type of thing with the fledgling esports betting industry. For example, New Jersey famously seriously vetted the League of Legends World Championship finals before allowing them, as the exception to the exception, to be betted on. You may recall we've talked about certain famous match fixing events in the past. It's thankfully rare, but it does happen. To me, far and away, the most interesting event of that involves Life, StarCraft 2 players, Life and BB Young, who, Life was regarded as almost, it's hard to find agreement among internet people, especially StarCraft 2 gamers, but most people agreed at one point that he was one of the best players in the entire world, even when he was only 15. And he ended up going down for match fixing. He won over $70,000 apparently for throwing 2 games, or 70,000 Korean won. But
how much in dollars?
He ended up, I don't know.
It's a good
I don't
Jeopardy
have
question.
my won to dollar calculator on me, but I would not want to have to give that up.
Right.
And ultimately, after the investigation and the prosecution, Life was sentenced to 18 months in prison. That's a year and a half in prison for throwing a couple games, and he had to give back the money that he got.
The audience really doesn't understand how sad you were when this news was released, because Nick had to take his Life posters down from his room. He was so upset
shook.
when this
happened.
He was shook to the core when this happened. Poor guy. But this is out of events like this. Third-party organizations have actually been formed to help police the scene, because it is a big deal. And the only way esports gambling is going to move forward is if there's if match fixing is addressed and integrity is introduced and upheld.
Right.
And so there's the esports.
It has to be legitimate and it has to look legitimate.
Right. And that's why you have like the Esports Integrity Coalition, among others. But just a side note, interesting tidbit, Nick. StarCraft 2 was the number 6 top 10 esports bet of 2020. Just to kind of give you, it's not dead yet kind of
no dead
feel.
Game here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So some other...
all the people are betting on the 12 people still playing that game.
Is Life back? I don't know. I haven't checked, but he might be. Other times...
I think he's out of prison now, so...
Other times, gambling comes up in gaming. Loot boxes is one. We've talked about it before. Is it gambling? ? That's the big, debate. Is it consideration, chance, and prize? Some countries have said yes. Some countries have said no. Prize is oftentimes, in this particular instance, where this would fail, whether or not a loot box and engaging in it results in a prize. But having a market where you can...
that's determined, that's determined a lot by whether you can trade it, right?
Exactly.
If it's something you want personally, that's viewed differently than something you can then go and sell to somebody else.
Right. So what you most often find is in the terms of service of these companies that have the game, this particular virtual currency carries no value. So they can maybe undermine that prize definition or that prize element. But then there's other games, classically CSGO, which had a third-party marketplace that they supported that would allow for the trading and selling of certain items, hence why some people have called them gambling. So then you also have...
Some people, including the FTC.
Some people. You also have games that work with in-game currency and that kind of have a gambling feel, whether that be a classic casino-style game. Big Fish Casino case comes to mind, recently decided out of Washington. And in that case, you have an instance where if you have an illegal gambling activity, it's not regulated, or that the activity is not operating pursuant to a license, then what you might have is an instance where some states allow the person who lost the money to get their money back from the house. It's like a punishment kind of law for acting that way. And so in this instance, that's what happened. And the legal analysis boiled down to whether or not the virtual currency used to buy to play the game, whether that had any value. And even though the chips didn't, there was a mechanism for transferring chips between users, which could be considered like cashing out winnings, right? And so because those chips could be exchanged and that they extended the privilege of playing time, the court actually said they fell within the definition of a thing of value, i.e. consideration, under Washington law. So that was an interesting and big case for the gambling and gaming industry in particular. So just it's a fast-moving space. And because it's fast-moving, lots of moving parts, and so many different opinions on how to handle it, that creates risk. And so you might be wondering whether or not the reward of running an illegal gambling operation is worth the risk. That's like the big risk, right? That's the first.
What's your professional advice on that,
I
Steve?
can't give it, because we said that this is not where we offer advice, and we're going to stick to that, and we're just going to move on to just issue spot, right? Issue spot. So I just want to point this other one out because it came out in the Big Fish case. But in addition to just getting in trouble with a regulator, you could get tagged in one of these states that have laws allowing people who have lost money gambling to sue the house back for their money. That's just not something that oftentimes people are aware
independent of criminal liability.
Yeah,
right?
You might get tagged with both of them. You're running an illegal gambling operation, and the person who lost their money wants their money back and has a statute that allows for it. So lots of different things to consider. And ultimately, and we didn't even get into where the payment processor gets in, trouble. There's a whole statute that regulates them. If they're participating in illegal gambling, they could get in trouble. So then they stop processing your payments. And so there's risk there. Anyway.
All the way up and down the chain.
There's a lot of risk. We could go on forever, not going to. But Nick, why don't you cap it off with the future and how it's looking in this space?
Yeah, so the bottom line is keep an eye on this. History has taught us that where people compete, people end up betting on it. So it's natural that as the competitive esports industry continues to experience its dramatic growth, so will the related gambling community that it is going to be based on it. So that's not going away. But as more interest and money is generated, do look for more controversies and regulation. The patchwork state-by-state regulation that we described may be outdated even by the time this podcast recording goes live. And certainly by this time next year, the state-by-state landscape is going to look very different than it does right now. Can't really predict exactly what it's going to look like, other than probably not going to be uniform, and you're going to want to really know what the rules are in your jurisdiction.
Well done. Well said. But that brings us to the end of our episode, and want to thank you to our former co-host, regular contributor, Nick Brown, for joining us today. Thank you so much to our listeners.
Thank you so much for having me, Steve.
Well, thank you. I'd say plug something, but Nick doesn't do anything else that's interesting other than be a regular contributor on this podcast. So
my mixtape isn't done yet.
Okay, we'll be waiting for you to tell us when it lands. Be sure to check out other episodes of our Season 1 and Season 2 of the podcast. You can connect with us on social media, Instagram, Twitter, or on our webpage, landpartylawyers.com. We'd love to hear your thoughts and comments and opinions about the topics we cover, so if you have them, please reach out. And until next time,
game on.
Game on.
You've been listening to the Land Party Lawyers podcast series with Steve Blickensderfer. To learn more about our e-gaming and esports practice, visit carltonfields.com. This podcast is intended for general information and educational purposes only, and should not be relied on as if it were advice about a particular fact situation. The distribution of this podcast is not intended to create, and receipt of it does not constitute, an attorney-client relationship with Carlton Fields. Thanks for listening.